Mary Bowerman was one of botanist Willis Lynn Jepson's graduate students at the University of California at Berkeley in the 1930s. Bowerman said she was chosen to study Mount Diablo because she was the only botany student with a car. Well, she definitely proved herself up to the task. In 1944, she published The Flowering Plants and Ferns of Mount Diablo, a book that's still the Bible for botanists today. In the 1970s, she helped found both the Mount Diablo Interpretive Association, which fosters appreciation and enlightened use of the state park, and Save Mount Diablo, which has dramatically expanded protected land on and around the mountain. Mary was born in Toronto in 1908. She was strong-willed and a bit of a rebel, preferring boys' haircuts and clothing. She lived in England for a time, attended Pasadena Junior College in Southern California, and entered UC Berkeley in 1928. Her well-to-do parents wanted her to become a doctor, but she had other ideas. At age 15, she thought she'd become a gardener. As an undergraduate at Berkeley, she majored in botany and stayed on to earn a PhD. People describe her as reserved, but determined to make her way in the world. Botanist Heath Bartosh says,
when Jepson had assigned her Mount Diablo to do her graduate work, he initially thought it was going to be a master's thesis, but she came back and told him, no, it's going to be a doctorate. So it was that kind of, I guess, quiet confidence, or really knowing what you want and going after it.
Bowerman began her Diablo research right after fires swept across 25,000 acres on the mountain in 1931. Her book chronicles the mountain's comeback. She describes which plants rebounded first, where they were, how long they lasted, and how the mountain looked a few years later.
It was probably the most well-documented local information on fire ecology in the East Bay at the time.
The 1931 blazes were just the beginning of Mary's fire ecology education. Here's East Bay Regional Park District General Manager Robert Doyle.
Mary was an absolute expert in fire recovery because she had the years to watch it. And there were fires, huge fires, in the 30s and 40s and 70s on Mount Diablo. In the 77 fire, Dean Lesher from the Contra Costa Times had raised the money in the Times to restore Mount Diablo, and it was replant Mount Diablo, and Mary was outraged. So she really tried to get professors there to talk about that it will restore itself. Yes, you need to deal with erosion and clear the creeks, but it will restore itself. And so she was really focused on that.
Eventually, Bowerman won, and Mount Diablo State Park used the money the newspaper had raised to build the Mary Bowerman Trail around the top of the mountain. Today, it's one of the park's most popular trails. While working on her PhD, Mary thought she would become a teacher. But she found that she liked research better than teaching, and later, when some of her favorite places were threatened with development, her research took a back seat to advocacy. In 1971, she and electrical engineer Art Bonwell co-founded Save Mount Diablo. In the early days, one of Save Mount Diablo's friends in Sacramento was Republican Senator John Nedgedly. One time, Mary and Robert Doyle, who was then on Save Mount Diablo's board, went to the senator with an urgent request.
We were in John Nedgedly's office in Sacramento, and we really needed to buy a piece of property that was going to be bought by Albertino. We asked the senator to do a bill to get funding. He said, it's way too late, I can't do this, it's beyond the season to submit legislation. And he got really angry. And Mary says, can't you just do a little more? She was dead serious about acquiring a piece of property. The good news was, a week later, he allocated the money for this project and we were able to acquire it.
Robert Doyle still feels Mary's influence.
Being tenacious, being scientifically accurate, doing your research, and paying attention to detail were all Mary Bowerman things that have greatly benefited me and greatly benefited the East Bay and the Park Districts and Save Mount Diablo.
When Seth Adams became Save Mount Diablo's first staff member in 1988, he was surprised to find that half of the organization's $26,000 budget came out of Mary Bowerman's pocket. His initial ideas about protecting the mountain came from Mary, too, and he frequently quotes a statement she made in 1971. She said, "My dream is that the whole of Mount Diablo, including its foothills, will remain open space, that the visual and natural integrity will be sustained." It's a strong call to action in a rapidly growing community, but Seth chuckles about one thing.
The second part of the quote is always left out, which is that they hoped it would be completed by the time of the bicentennial in 1976. They thought this was a 5-year project.
Mary's work had taken her onto private lands that few others knew. When those lands came up for sale, she could quickly identify what was most valuable.
She was an incredibly keen observer. She was slow as all get out. As botanists are in general, you measure it in feet per hour, not in miles per hour. And if you were walking on this trail with Mary Bowerman, there's a crook in the trail up here. And Mary would say, "That's one of the 3 places where columbine blooms on Mount Diablo every year." Her sense of place was to the level of knowing individual plants all over the mountain. Plants that had been there, or generations of plants that had successively been there her entire life.
Mary was directly involved in saving places on the mountain that many of us take for granted today. North Peak, Mitchell, Back, and Donner Canyons, Black Hawk Ridge, the Black Hills, and Sycamore Canyon, Pine Canyon and Castle Rock, White Canyon and Riggs Canyon. By the time she reached her 80s and 90s, Mary had achieved almost saint-like status among community leaders. She won numerous awards and was named a fellow at the California Native Plant Society, that organization's highest honor. But she kept on working. In those days, Seth Adams would sometimes drive her to Save Mount Diablo board meetings. At the end of the evening,
She'd say, "So, what are you doing now?" As I was dropping her off at her house, and I'd say, "Well, I'm going to go dancing in the city. Do you want to go?" And she would think for a second. She was thoughtful about everything, and she'd say, "Not tonight, but maybe next time. Ask me again." She never got a job at a university as a botanist, but in her mid-60s, she created a conservation organization which would expand on her legacy in a way that affects the entire state of California and the Bay Area. You just have to give her incredible credit for starting something that's made such a huge difference to so many people.
in our next segment, Heath pays his respects to some of the other botanists who've explored Mount Diablo.